Poetry lives outside. The resonance of what is, the process of becoming. This oscillating thou art that is nature and ourselves dissolving. You are of the mud, touching time. Notice the intimacy. Alive on the terms of nature. A mother who would not allow the devil called the old gods. Entangled breath, life. The wind knows it is not a human dance. Step outside into my own offerings. Poetry lives outside, meaning outside human management, in the mountains, in the forest, in the body, in the mind. This is where my and Bringhurst's idea of poetry differs from Bachelard's poetics, as his emphasis is on the sorts of space that can be grasped, that may be defended against adverse forces, the domestic human-controlled sphere. This reference to outside is specifically to that which is not controlled by humans. It is not to posit a subject-object dualism in the sense that Morton uses in Dark Ecology. The subject-object dualism depends on a distinction between inside and outside. The subject is this, over here, inside. The object is that, over there, outside. The idea of poetry I explore here is a quality of interconnectedness, a tentacular SF mycelial resonance of what is, that can be found in mountains, trees, rivers, rocks, clouds, and in molecules and subatomic particles. Akin to Boehm's concept of wholeness, what is the process of becoming itself. Indeed, in the words of Kearney, poetics is the double play of recreation, and this oscillating tension flies in the face of traditional dichotomies between subject and object, mind and matter, active and passive, which inform the history of Western thought. Morton claims that subject-object dualism is not just a Western concept and uses the Hindu mantra Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, as evidence. However, it self-evidently means the opposite. All beings are intimately connected to universal energy and cannot be separated from it. Morton also tries to provide evidence for subject-object dualism using quantum physics, claiming that in the universe according to quantum mechanics, things can be either particles or waves, but not both simultaneously. There's nothing behind these in the standard model that can be either or worse, both at once. However, quantum physics tells us the opposite. The pleasure and pain of quantum theory began when an or became an and. Are the fundamental components of material reality particles or waves? The answer came back from quantum theory loud and clear, both, at the same time. Indeed, based on his work in quantum physics, Bohm suggested we live in a universe of unbroken wholeness. Putting aside Morton's apparent misunderstandings, what is of interest here is the argument that the concept of subject-object dualism is used to support. Morton's book, Dark Ecology, focuses on a critique of ecological art, in particular eco-mimesis, a specific rhetoric that generates a fantasy of nature as a surrounding atmosphere, palpable but shapeless. They write that ecological writing wants to undo habitual distinctions between nature and ourselves, a dissolving of the difference between subject and object, a dualism seen as a fundamental philosophical reason for human beings' destruction of the environment. They characterize this as self-defeating. The ambient poetics that establishes this experience interferes with attempts to set up a unified transcendent nature, because the very processes that try to convey the illusion of immediacy and naturalness keep dispelling it from within. Morton argues that the immersive aesthetic approach of ecomimesis, and by extension the idealized fantasy of nature, like the Kantian idea of the sublime, perpetuates the distance between the reader or viewer and the environment. It is always over there, behind, distance aesthetic experience, even when you are in it, as the elegiac frenzy of much nature writing demonstrates. In Morton's view, the most ethical act is to love the other precisely in their artificiality, rather than seeking to prove their naturalness and authenticity. However, in addition to the factual errors mentioned above, even their conclusion is paradoxical, or at least seems to want to retain the idea of subject-object dualism while involving a more non-dual approach. Instead of postulating a non-dualistic pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, we could hang out in what feels like dualism. This hanging would be a more non-dual approach. Instead of trying to pull the world out of the mud, we could jump down into the mud. I am not convinced. I suspect that they lapse into colloquialism to elide vast gaps in their argument. What is hanging out exactly? Why, what feels like dualism rather than just dualism? What is a more non-dual approach, and why is it not monism? Their metaphor of the mud presupposes dualism, or, if pulling the world out of the mud is supposedly oneness, then so is jumping into the mud. It is as if Morton is trying to cross a chasm in 2 leaps. If they were indeed successful, I'd like to see more specifics. In All Art is Ecological, Morton argues that the experience of art provides a model for the kind of coexistence ecological ethics and politics wants to achieve between humans and non-humans, and that, as artwork is itself a non-human being, this solidarity in the artistic realm is already solidarity with non-humans, whether or not the art is explicitly ecological. All art would presumably also include the ambient poetics of ecomimesis. Thus, this later position appears to contradict their previous one. I contend that the distancing idea of the sublime is something cultural, not inherent. Santeri Tuori's Waterfall No. 2, a video and sound work I've encountered in person, displays slowed-down footage of a glacial waterfall. It was utterly immersive, as it covered an entire expanse of wall, such as to fill my field of view, and, as per the gallery text, showed the immense beauty and depth of nature. In Tuori's words, standing in front of a glacier is a touching experience. Things come into perspective. The time of a human being seems like a droplet compared to the time of a glacier. There is something dignified about glaciers, their movement and their posture. This might be described as a sublime experience, both in terms of Tuori's experience of the vast temporal and physical scale of the glacier, the sublime in nature, and my immersive experience of the artwork itself, the sublime in art. Focusing on the idea of the sublime in nature, in the experience of the sublime, the more threatening and terrifying of nature's manifestations, such as mountains and wilderness, when viewed with disinterestedness, can be aesthetically appreciated rather than simply feared or despised. Notice the underlying assumptions. The wild is assumed to be threatening and terrifying, and something to be feared or despised, and disinterest, that which creates distance, is thus necessary for aesthetic appreciation. However, Tuori's description of the glacier contains no threat or fear or indeed distance. Instead, his use of touching suggests emotional intimacy, and dignified movement and posture are words describing another being, an equal. As Tuori continues, glaciers almost feel as though they are alive. This embracing animistic idea, as opposed to the distancing of the sublime, is perhaps a cultural one, as Tuori, like me, is from Finland, a place that has historically and culturally had a closer relationship with the wild than the Western world. Macfarlane reports that the disappearance of the true wildwood occurred in the Neolithic period, and Morton argues that from that time agrico-logistics, the logistics of the dominant form of agriculture, has prevailed. As a result of the settlements that were created, people began to draw distinctions between the human and non-human realms that continue to this day. And, according to Macfarlane, wildness has been perceived as a dangerous force that confounds the order-bringing pursuits of human culture and agriculture. However, Finland remained forested, with the people living on the terms of nature long after the Neolithic. The Finnish word for wild is villi. Its similarity to the Norse villr, indicating its origin as a word borrowed from the Scandinavian crusaders and colonizers, suggesting there was no name for the wild previously, and hence no concept of the wild, as there was no gap between the human and non-human realms. Christianity, a religion of agrico-logistics, came to the Baltic edges of Finland around 800 CE, but spread slowly. The ancient animistic traditions survived alongside Christianity despite continued religious cleansings, with the final sacred groves of indigenous worship only cut down in the middle of the 18th century. According to Oskari Ratinen, a spokesperson for a religious community based on indigenous Finnish spiritual tradition, terming these beliefs as ancient is misleading. They are ongoing and evolving. I was raised by a mother who would not allow the name of the devil to be spoken, lest we called him, yet spoke with respect of the old gods, such as Tapio, the forest god, not a ruler of the forest, but the forest itself embodied. Morton claims that animism is decidedly not nature worship. However, Anna-Leena Siikala, an expert on indigenous Finnish belief, prefers the term luonnon uskonto, which can be translated as the religion or belief of nature. In the words of Siikala, the Western theoretical approach and scientific worldview are not necessarily the best starting points for describing local beliefs. In cultures where people experience living with spirits, they are not supernatural, but part of their reality. The word I have translated as spirit, henki, has entangled meanings of breath and also life, a spirit being, the spirit, and a person. In its meaning life, the word henki can be used for all creatures, plants, and also of the life force that flows in the blood, beats in the heart, and thumps in the artery. If I used Finnish to describe my performance for the outrun mentioned in the introduction, it would be tanssi tuulen hengen kanssa, a dance with the henki of the wind. And this is what I mean when I speak of poetry. What poetry knows, or what it strives to know, is the dancing at the heart of being. That is what the dance knows too, or strives to know, though it is not a human dance. Macfarlane writes that for him, to reach a wild place was to step outside human history, while for me it is to step into my own history. Like it or not, the river is my fellow tribesman too. So is the wind, so is the mountain, so is the tree. They may not be nourished by my words, and the gods may not prefer the kind of wine I can afford. I make my offerings even so.